Every news source from Indian Country Today to Globalnews and The Guardian has exploded in the past week with reports from Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick about violent police raids on an encampment of nonviolent protectors of the water and land. In order to prevent the poisoning of their waters and air, a multiracial coalition of Mi'kmaq people, French-speaking Acadians, and Anglophones have joined together to stop Southwestern Energy Resources, a hydrofracking company based out of Houston, Texas, from further exploiting shale gas in the region. Sam Koplinka Loehr, a resident of Ithaca, was at the blockade with a Christian Peacemaker Team, or CPT, delegation for the 2 weeks leading up to the police raid. He spoke on October 28th in downtown Ithaca about his time at the blockade, focusing on the work going on there to build multiracial alliances with indigenous leadership and decolonization at the center.
My name is Sam Koplinka Loehr. I grew up in the Ithaca area and went to school in Vermont, and I now live in Lansing, Lansing, New York. So I just got back from a trip to Elsipogtog, which is in New Brunswick. And for those of you who have trouble with geography, it's right above Maine, but on the Canada side. And there in the Elsipogtog area, it's all unceded Mi'kmaq territory. And Mi'kmaq is, some folks call the Mi'kmaq First Nation Micmac, so you might have heard of it as Micmac or Mi'kmaq. And the folks that people there use to self-identify as mostly Mi'kmaq and Ilnu are the terms. So the entire region of New Brunswick is all, in traditional terms, before first contact with white folks, it is the Mi'kmaq 6th district. And so it was the entire area was broken up into different districts, and this is the 6th district of the Mi'kmaq people. And then in terms of the settler term, it's right near Rexton, New Brunswick, about an hour away from Moncton. So that's kind of the geographical setting. In terms of the treaties, the Mi'kmaq people had treaties of friendship and harmony with the settlers that were coming in a few hundred years ago. They never surrendered their territory. It's all unceded, occupied Mi'kmaq territory. So that's kind of the historical setting for where we are. And some of the photos that's going around, the third photo is a picture of the testing lines that the multinational corporation SWN, or SWN, based out of Houston, Texas, was preparing in the past few months. So right now their main struggle is against the fracking industry. And in order to begin the first step of that, SWN comes in with these thumper trucks that thump the ground and basically create a virtual earthquake. And then they have data lines to determine, as the ground shakes, where the natural gas is underground. So that's this kind of the current action that SWN is taking, doing seismic testing to determine where the natural gas is under the ground.
What kind of permission does SWN have to come in there? Are they just going in? Do they have leases? What kind of contact do they have to ask permission?
Yep. So whereas in the United States, people often own their own mineral rights, in New Brunswick, the government owns the mineral rights. So people only own the top foot of whatever land they have. After that, the government can lease away everything that's underneath people. So people are only getting a payback for the first foot that the company has to drill through. So it's like $1,500, maybe $2,000 a year. It's really basically pittances. So one of the struggles that we have here is trying to convince landowners that might get, a few thousand, a few $100,000, depending, from the natural gas industries, the fracked gas industries. Their struggle is more educational, because at this point the New Brunswick government has already sold all the mineral rights in huge swaths, millions and millions of acres throughout New Brunswick. So 3 years ago, SWN started coming in and holding public meetings to try and convince the populace that this is a good idea, and that they should begin selling their land to SWN to begin drilling down. And at that point, in the public meetings, they were saying that fracking fluid is so safe that you could drink it. And people began waking up. They're like, oh, that's not what we've heard. And so they started questioning the government and started forming grassroots organizations. So that was about the first 2 years of activism in New Brunswick, was educational campaigns, bringing in speakers. There was a blue ribbon campaign where they tied blue ribbons everywhere to try and talk about clean water. But SWIN kept moving forward. So since June of this year, there's been more on the front lines direct action going on. And the first few photos, as you see as it gets passed around, are some of the people who are doing this direct action. It's for one of the first times in all of New Brunswick history, there's a coalition of Mi'kmaq people, Acadians, who were the French that settled there first before they were kicked out by the British who came later, and Anglophones. And then also now there's also been an international presence for about 3 months as well. So this kind of coalition of folks has actually been working together, which is a pretty historic moment, and working together with a pretty amazing framework of decolonization and supporting indigenous leadership as they're going forward. So beginning in June, SWIN started on lines 3 and 4 of one of the first images there, and which is basically a long strip across the county where they just go every 5 miles or so to do their testing. And so every step of the way, this coalition stopped them with their bodies, with nonviolent direct action, often blockading a testing site or blockading an access road or what have you. So early on in June, there were 35 arrests or so, and it was escalating more and more, and SWIN pulled out for about a month and a half and came back in the middle of September. Hello. And in the middle of September, they began doing testing along the roads. So before it was kind of in the backcountry, and then now it's on the roads using these thumper trucks. And the coalition, about 3 weeks ago now, decided to blockade the storage compound where these trucks required for testing are stored. So you'll see in the photos, the first step was like moving a van in front of the compound gate. And then they took down trees along the road to block the roads. And at that point, the police had blockaded about half a mile down each side. And that blockade lasted for about 2 weeks. During that point, during those 2 weeks, it was a really powerful time to be there. People had reclaimed the space of Highway 134. There was a sacred fire going in one area. It was basically drumming and ceremony every single morning, afternoon, and night. And there were definitely tensions in the camp along nonviolence or violence strategies. But for the most part, people were working together, and there was a talking circle for a good portion of those 2 weeks every day to kind of work out some of those issues, for people to learn where everyone else is coming from and try and figure out what's our strategy going forward. About a week in, the Band Council, the Elsipogtog Band Council, and the traditional Grand Council, and the distinguishment there is that the Band Council of Elsipogtog, the First Nation nearby, is appointed by the Canadian government originally, whereas the Grand Council is the traditional form of leadership that's existed since time immemorial among the Mi'kmaq people. So both of them voted to reclaim all the crown lands in the area. This has never been done before. It's a very historic moment. People, like 500 people were filling this road. 500 people were fed a whole meal, and it was an unbelievable moment. So basically what that means is that they say no longer are we going to let the British Crown or the Canadian government have control over all of our land, which is a huge section of New Brunswick for the 6th district of Signatuk, which is the Mi'kmaq section there. Yeah, does that make sense to everyone?
Yep.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
First, thank you for going and for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You said it was unceded territory, so how does the government of British Columbia have then, I'd like to see the paperwork that says we own this and we're going to lease it right out from under you. How does that work there?
Totally. And that's what everyone has been asking. They've been demanding that the New Brunswick government provide documentation of owning it. and everyone there knows there is no documentation because the only thing that exists are these treaties of peace and harmony between two peoples. What's that? Which they've broken time and time and time again. And just by living and operating on the land, they're constantly in violation of the treaties.
So, when they're saying the crown land, so not people's personal property, but
Correct.
just anything that the government owns, they're saying.
Yeah, or at least the government says that they own.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In New York, we've been working around the two-row wampum.
Yep.
Do they have any, like the settlers don't seem to, they seem to have lost their papers, but the natives have the wampum bill, the original wampum bill. Do they have anything like that?
Right. So what they have is the paper documentation of the treaties, which is the strongest legal argument there, and it's pretty strong. Yeah.
So they preserved those papers?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Where was I? Oh, right. So that press conference was, and there's a photo of it with the Chief Aaron Sock and a few other leaders who have been involved in the nonviolent resistance for the past 3 months. And there's one photo of the press conference where you'll see the chief and a few people kind of in warrior fatigues. And that is emblematic of who's been present at the blockade. So there's like a few different contingencies. There are settler NGOs that are present. There's the Band Council, which is the Elsipogtog Band Council. There's the Warrior Society, which is the Mi'kmaq Warriors, and you might have heard about them on the news or something. But the Mi'kmaq Warrior Society is another group separate from any First Nation, but representing the people of Mi'kma'ki, which is the Mi'kmaq territory. And their mission, basically, is to take their orders from the people, from the grandmothers, from the youth, from the elders, and protect the women and children, is how they identify their mission, as in whatever way that it requires. So whether that's using nonviolent or violent means. And they've existed for the past 200 plus years defending Mi'kma'ki. So that's another of the constituencies that's there. And that was kind of where the tension really lay between this whole group that has of different NGOs and different people from the First Nations, Acadians, Anglophones, who have all agreed to be nonviolent. And then there's the Mi'kmaq Warrior Society, which is saying by any means necessary. So this tension was really played up in the week before the raid. And it was unclear whether or not people who were there were actually playing it up, or whether there were police provocateurs who were kind of trying to stir things up. But needless to say, at one point, some folks were saying, oh, the warriors are bringing in guns. And whether or not that was actually true, that's kind of what the police used as their excuse to raid the camp. So near the end of the photos, you'll see the police lines coming in. There were 500 police officers who raided the camp, and 40 plus people arrested, tear gas, rubber bullets, just really horrific police crackdown. Snipers all around the area. It was really, I wasn't there at that time, but from everything I was getting via text and online, it was really intense. So that really was like, then after that, all the information and the message of this coalition spread like wildfire. The news took it up in the US and in Canada, and by the next day there were 40-something solidarity protests across Turtle Island. And so that, some people would say that actually it was, as horrific as the crackdown was, it also brought the message of the people and spread it across the land. So the day after, the folks who were there blockaded the local highway, and mostly what's happening now is playing things out in the court. There are 6 people who have faced, 6 members of the Warrior Society who are currently incarcerated and have 37 charges against them at this point. They haven't even gotten through their bail hearings yet. So it's pretty atrocious what's happening in the courts. And then there's been these solidarity protests across Canada and the U.S. So that's kind of where things are at this point. The injunction from the company SWN has been denied I think on the 21st it was denied. So people are now allowed to reassemble at the site, but the trucks for testing have left the site. So, yeah. No one knows where they are right now. Yeah. They're still kind of trying to keep their ears out for if testing is continuing, and people aren't really sure what the status is there.
So they were effective in keeping the trucks inside the depot so they could not do the seismic testing?
Yep, so that was effective for a little over 2 weeks. And by their own calculations, by the calculations of folks who were there, $60,000 a day for the security personnel who were surrounding the trucks, and just not being able to work since they were renting the trucks for every day. They calculated it was $60,000 a day for the company. And at one point, the stocks fell like 18% at one of the critical days of the action. So people were pretty happy with how the blockade went, but feeling like it has to continue to be that level of intensity in order to stop things from moving forward. And it's been some controversy over the band council leadership in that there's been some leaking of various notes from meetings and stuff that makes it sound like the Chief Aaron Sock is actually not in support of future blockades and not really with the people in that sense, and instead wants people to just protest with signs and what have you. So that's, yeah, another kind of tension within the coalition there.
I saw a video clip which showed a lot of vehicles that had been burned, and something said a lot of them were police or Royal Canadian police, but the vehicles that I saw were not. They looked like, vans and cars and ordinary. So were people hurt, and what was going on with the kind of the intense action?
Yeah. So to respond to the first portion, I believe all the vehicles were either visibly RCMP vehicles or they were undercover vehicles, like unmarked RCMP vehicles. So I think all 6 vehicles were the police vehicles. The day before the raid, a few people showed up in the camp the night before, and no one knew who they were. They were dressed in the warriors' fatigues, and one said they were journalists, but no one really knew who they were. The next day, they were seen after there were 7 Molotov cocktails thrown out from the woods, and the police fired into the woods. After that, that same group was seen coming out of the woods, and they said, "We can't take this, we're leaving." So it's all kind of rumor. Was it the warriors who threw them? Was it these group of individuals who just randomly showed up who threw them? It's unclear who actually burned the cop cars. Yeah, both sides say the other side did it.
How many were in your delegation of Christian Peacemaker teams, and what exactly did you do?
Yep. So I first arrived there with a group called CPT, Christian Peacemaker Teams, and they've had a presence on the ground for 3 months or so. And a lot of the time so they were there for about 10 days, and then I continued on to about 2+ weeks on site. And a lot of the time with them was spent actually working on ourselves. So as a predominantly group of white folks, and 8 out of 9 of us were settlers, not native to the area. A lot of our work that we had to do was continuing the process of decolonizing our own minds as we went into this space. And especially as white folks and also as Christians, it's a tremendous amount of baggage with First Nations in Canada. The Catholic Church, throughout the past 60 or so years leading up to 1990, had forced education for all young Native folks. And they would kidnap young First Nations people at the ages of 4, 5, 6 and steal them away from their homes into Catholic schools and force assimilation, basically. The motto was kill the child, or kill the Indian, leave the child. And it's just a horrific history, and a lot of the elders in Elsipogtog remember being in these forced schooling. So the work that, especially as a Christian group going into support, firstly, they only go in when they're asked by the community to come in to support. But secondly, the first few days of being on site was very intentional anti-racism trainings, decolonization trainings. And so that was a lot of the work that we were doing. And then it was relationship building. It was meeting the different coalitional people who were there. So the NGOs, the traditional leadership of Elsipogtog, and kind of just getting a sense of who was there and why they were there and all that. So it was mostly, I would say like 90% of the time the delegation was actually there was spent building relationships and learning for the people who were on it, so when they went back home, they could tell the stories in a way that were most accurate to what people were actually doing and feeling on site. And then there was like that last 10% that was doing the supportive role of taking as many photos and as much video as possible, so that when there was a question about how the police treated people on site, they would have footage of it. And that was probably like 10% or so. Did that get to your question?
Could you talk about, you said decolonization of your own Christian white mind. What does that look like on a day-to-day? What is that?
Yeah. So first of all, the main thing that was all of us really had to work on was the savior mentality, which is really ingrained in white society and really ingrained in Christian thinking for the past few hundred years. And basically, a lot of organizations that come into, even grassroots organizations that come into these situations, often have that mentality of like, we are going to make this all better. We're gonna save folks here. We're gonna end this issue, and haha, we've arrived. So first of all, it was kind of throwing that out the door and getting rid of that ideology. And there's a great quote by an Aboriginal woman in Australia that goes, "If you've come to save me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because you see your liberation as tied up in my own, then let us work together," or something along those lines. And that, I think, was kind of the guiding principle for the trip, that not so much are we actually going to help people, but we're going to learn why we should tear down the systems of government that we have, why we should tear down the colonial system that's ruled over Canada and the United States for a few hundred years now. So that, I think, is the main essence of what CPT and other organizations are beginning to learn, is maybe our work is actually best spent trying to tear down all these oppressive systems rather than trying to think that we're saving somebody. Does that get to your question?
As far as the legal support for the members of the Warrior Society, which are incarcerated right now, well, first, are there others than them? And secondly, who is providing the kind of legal support? Have the mainstream environmental groups gotten behind any of that, or are they sort of kind of out there by themselves and with communities trying to deal with this? And just comment a little bit about the kind of support within society in New Brunswick for this action and the legal resources which have been brought to bear, and like what can we do over here to show our support?
Yeah, so they definitely need money, is the short answer. They are the people who are actually on the ground doing direct action, and especially the Warrior Society, are completely underfunded. They have like a donation box at a local gas station, and that's one way that they're trying to get money. And another is from celebrities who have heard about the issue and given money to legal support. But the last I heard is they need more money. And in particular, there was also the idea of doing a counter lawsuit against the government to try and prove that the treaties exist, first of all, and that the government and SWIN are illegal trespassers on Mi'kmaq territory. And that is perhaps the best shot for ending fracking in the area, but it requires a tremendous amount of money to hire the lawyers and have probably a few year-long lawsuit to get to the Supreme Court. So, yeah, I'd say the support is divided. There's some people who support the warriors, and there's a lot of other people who have been kind of publicly slamming the warriors for being too X, Y, or Z, and they're trying to work through the government structures to try and make change, whereas the warriors are completely outside of the government structures.
How did the injunction get overturned? I mean, I saw the video, the wonderful video when they got the announcement and they're all just like ecstatic outside, but how did that actually come about?
The injunction in Elsipogtog has been removed. Woo! A brief summary, what just happened in court?
What happened? The judge found no reason to place an injunction on the people or to extend it at all. It is finished. There is no more injunction on the people who have been named or the Jane and John Does of New Brunswick. The injunction, in my mind, was probably illegal.
And I don't know if it was a liberal enough judge or what have you, but basically said no longer is the site actually being actively blockaded anymore. The company can get in and out, and that's what the purpose of the injunction is. So the ability for people to assemble there and protest there is completely legal. So the judge kind of took in their interpretation of the law, that was what the ruling was.
How do you feel that you personally changed? How are you different before you went and now?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is having hope, and is as depressing as the raid was, it was also immensely hopeful to be there in that space. So one of the guiding prophecies that people on site were working with and talking about regularly is the 7 fires prophecy. That 7 prophets came to the Anishinaabe and to the Mi'kmaq, and this was before the arrival of the lighter-skinned race, white folks. And the prophets said that when the lighter-skinned race arrives, if they are wearing the face of friendship, there will be a great society with all the people on Turtle Island that's both materially and spiritually grounded. If they're wearing the face of death, there will be immense destruction of Native folks and the social and ecological landscape of Turtle Island, which is another name for North America. So, lighter-skinned folks came with the face of death, and there was immense destruction. And the 7th prophet said that in the future, in order to avert ecological and social collapse, if all of the races come together and give up the life of extreme materialism, then the 8th fire will be lit, which is when the 8th fire is lit, it's a time of harmony between races and balance with the natural world. So that was what people were talking about daily at the site. And really it was that all colors of the medicine wheel were represented: white, yellow, black, and red. And it was inspiring to be in that space of people really feeling like, wow, there's so much conversation of accepting each other, and a lot of Acadians and Anglophones were saying that in their mind, their own stereotypes of Native folks were being broken down, and in turn, Native folks having healing around working side by side with settlers. It wasn't ideal, but it was pretty close to what the prophecy said. It was very beautiful to be in that space. And usually I'm pretty critical of situations where it feels like it's not quite being realized, but it really felt for a few moments there like that the prophecy was being realized. And so that was what I came away with, was the hope that we actually could have harmony in some semblance and begin to work towards more balanced relationships with the natural world and each other. And we'll see what the coming year brings in terms of how their struggle at Elsipogtog goes, but it's inspiration, I would say.